The July-August edition of the Ryder Report, our bi-monthly nationwide newsletter, charting markets right across the country, is very timely because it's happening at a pivotal time in Australian real estate. So much has changed in the last 3 months or so. Most of the change has been for the better if you're an owner of real estate or interested in getting into the markets, because a series of fortunate events has led to a big turnaround in sentiment, a rise in confidence, and that's now translated into real action in the property market. We can actually see real evidence now of uplift in markets, particularly in the major ones, but right around the country, markets are starting to pump again more strongly. The main feature article in this edition of the Ryder Report actually presents a series of pieces of statistical evidence that markets uplift, such as improvement in vacancy rates, evidences that price decline in the major city has stopped and that prices are starting to rise again, increase in lending for real estate, and a whole heap of other pieces of statistical data that show that that real estate is very much on the comeback trail in the major markets. It never stopped in some of the smaller centres, the regional markets in some of the smaller cities like Hobart and Adelaide, for example. But the media rhetoric has been overwhelmingly negative for a long time, and that's turned around because we're now seeing evidence that that prices are rising again in those places where they weren't, and that generally there's an uplift not only in sentiment but in activity. So we record all that in this new July-August edition of the Ryder Report. I have a special commentary on where things are at with regional markets, making the point that many of the best places to consider for property investment right now are in the regions, cheaper prices, better rental yields, and if you pick the right locations, great prospects for growth right now. There's an interesting feature in one of our sections of the Ryder Report on the stark contrast between how the top end of the Sydney market and the top end of the Melbourne market have reacted to the recent downturn. The Sydney version of the top end has been very resistant to downturn. We haven't seen price decline in that market, whereas in Melbourne, quite the opposite. The biggest decline in prices in Melbourne in the last 12 months have been in the so-called prestige suburbs. Interesting contrast there. Also a contrast between what's happened with prices, both short-term and long-term, in Melbourne and the top end, with the cheaper areas where in many cases prices haven't declined and the long-term growth rates are much better. And our featured section, one of the places that we focus on is the Northern Territory capital, Darwin, which has been a downturn market for the past 4 or 5 years, but we're now seeing increasing evidence that that market at last is starting to show signs of growth again. In our state-by-state section, which we have in every edition of the Ryder Report, we examine what's really going on in markets in the capital cities and some of the regional areas of the various states and territories across Australia, as opposed to the fairly shallow commentary and so-called analysis that we get in major media. So it's, I think, a unique report in the Australian real estate landscape. It has an in-depth look at what's really going on in markets right across the country. It's called the Ryder Report. We publish it every couple of months. The July-August edition is out now. Get yourself a copy and read it, because you'll be a better informed real estate consumer if you do that. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, signing off. Let's talk again soon.